The U.S. military is always a little bit behind the trend when it comes to warfare, but is the leaked story about why they are just so behind implementation on drones going to upset even a cynic like me? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's do it. Okay, so this is one of those stories that this summarizes, I think, the bureaucratic nightmare that is the U.S. military. And that is because one of the biggest reasons U.S. Army units refuse to train with unmanned systems, i.e. unit-level drones, is actually because, no kidding, paperwork, right? And this is actually not units being lazy. This is just units being smart, right? So let's take a look at it. U.S. Army is looking to reclassify its small drones because of what they call a concerning flaw, but this is actually a policy failure in the U.S. Army system that stops soldiers from ever training with them, right? And that is the red tape that comes with losing a drone. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. You're thinking, Paul, the Ukrainians lose hundreds, maybe even thousands of drones a day, right? They're on pace to produce 1 million this year, and they expect to lose basically 75% of them. So why then is the U.S. Army freaking out if soldiers lose a single drone? And again, the absurdity just keeps compounding the more you think about it, because the U.S. military's budget is greater than that of most countries. And so the fact is that the U.S. Army investigating the loss of a single drone is kind of patently absurd. But that's exactly what happens. Because a drone is considered a major end item, regardless of size or price tag, the loss of one is treated the exact same way, which means reporting paperwork, a mandatory investigation, and possible loss of pay. As Colonel Nick Ryan, a director with the Army Capability Management for Unmanned Aerial Systems, said, quote, "If you lose a drone or crash it or break it, you have to do this full-on investigation. An investigating officer has to be appointed and determine liability. And if a soldier is liable, they have to get docked pay." That's because every drone is considered non-expendable property, right? A major end item, meaning it has to be accounted for and tracked. And if you lose a drone, even in combat, guys, it triggers a financial liability investigation of property loss, or a FLIPL. Now, before I talk to you guys about the fact that this is insane and what exactly a FLIPL is, including my own experience with combat loss FLIPLs, I want to mention that if you feel like you need something that's expendable and gonna enhance your capacities, you don't need to change Army policy. You may just need more caffeine. That's why you want to check out Strike Gum. With 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, each piece of Strike Gum packs the punch of an entire energy drink like a Red Bull or Amp Energy, but we have zero sugar. Plus, obviously, we're veteran owned and we're made in the USA down in Denver. Yeah, it'd be a little cheaper to make in China, but you know what? Fuck China. Right? We're here to support the US of A. So go to strikegum.com, right? And bring your energy into the 21st century, right? We can all leave energy drinks behind. They taste like cough medicine, they're overly sugar, and they're way overly expensive. So join the thousands of people who have switched to Strike Gum. Okay, so why exactly is this insane? Okay, for a couple reasons. First off, right, the US Army used to just say, listen, equipment breaks when you're training. That's just life, and we don't worry about it. The problem is, it meant that soldiers treated Army property like shit, right? They would like, for example, drive a tank over huge ditches for laughs, and then the Army would have to repair it at tremendous cost. So the Army sat there and said, listen, we can't do things like this. Now, we have two kinds of items: expendable and not expendable, essentially. Well, there's like major end items and BII, and things are classified differently. But the fundamental principle is that there's items that you can lose and there's items that you can't, right? And the ones you can't lose generally are called major end items: lose or destroy. And in most cases, right, if you looked at drones in the 2010s, right, 2010, for example, when I was deployed to Afghanistan, drones really came in just one flavor: big, aircraft, right? They looked like Predators, Reapers, or Shadows. These were aircraft that were actually flown by pilots remotely in Nevada. And so what you had then is multi-million-dollar items that if they crashed, it was a big problem. It was closer in terms of cost to crashing a combat aircraft, right? In contrast, you have things like munitions, right? A grenade, even like a Hellfire missile, right? If a fighter takes off and flies over the air and a unit says, hey, fighter jet, I need close air support, right? Nobody's going to say anything if that fighter jet says, I have a Hellfire, time to solve this problem, right? And the fighter jet lands, they say, what happened to Hellfire? He goes, I shot it at some insurgents. And the DOD goes, good, that's what we bought it for, right? There's no investigation. Here's the problem. When a major end item gets destroyed, that isn't like a munition, like a Hellfire. That's more like a drone, right? But a major end item can also be some pretty absurdly cheap stuff, like a tent, like sometimes like a radio, even an optic, right? Those red dot sights, the kind that you put a little battery in and buy for $200. Those are considered major end items. In fact, they're considered sensitive items. And so you end up in this situation where sometimes very, very cheap items that maybe when they first came out, they were cutting edge military tech, they get classified as non-expendable items, right? A red dot sight is actually, I think, a great example. Because when they first came out, holographic sights were like some turbo advanced stuff, especially ones that could run hours off a single watch battery. But now I can buy that at Walmart. But the Army never updated its system. So it still says that holographic sights are items of extreme sensitivity. So what happens when one goes missing? Well, the answer is the Army says we need to get to the bottom of this. And so what they'll do is a FLIPL. Now, here's the next level of why the FLIPL is absurd. Is because the first thing the Army does is appoint an investigating officer, right? And I was the FLIPL investigating officer a lot because I had a brain and I could write and I could work quick, right? And so what you do is that FLIPL's, that officer stops whatever they're doing. They drop their job. And then they focus solely on determining what happened to this major end item. Why did it go missing? They interview soldiers, collect evidence, take photographs. If you're like, wow, that sounds like a criminal investigation, that's exactly what it is. You can interview anybody, go anywhere in order to do it, right? And so what you end up with, of course, is usually it takes 1 to 2 weeks of time to investigate a FLIPL. And when you're done, you'll recommend a couple of course of action. You could say, hey, nobody's really at fault for losing this thing. That'll get you in trouble. You can't, nobody gets off scot-free. Somebody has to get blamed. Then you can say, hey, here's some other things that we should do in the future to stop this from happening, right? And so after 2 weeks of an officer having their full-time job pivot to being FLIPL investigator, they come out with this report, and then they go to the soldier who basically, usually it's the person who last touched the item, and says, hey, you got to pay this. You got to pay the Army back for the item. And so, again, what you end up with is some insanity. So you'll sit there and take an officer 2 weeks of their time and say, listen, I've spent 2 weeks, I've interviewed dozens of soldiers, I've written this report, I've sent it to the commander who's reviewed and approved it, and we've determined that our $168 holographic sight was in fact the responsibility of the person who had it on their rifle. And that's what we do with drones, right? This is a problem because, well, imagine if you were to sit there and operate like a Ukrainian unit, where in a typical week, you'll burn through, let's say, 6 drones. Imagine having to get 6 officers assigned to 6 FLIPLs, interviewing everyone just to determine that you flew the drone into a fucking Russian tank, right? And in fact, one particular drone was known among soldiers as, quote, the flying FLIPL, because it was so finicky, right? And here's the problem, guys. How do you get good at flying a drone? Guess what? You gotta mess up a few drones. And for the Ukrainians, they say it's a cost doing business. Yeah, you have a simulator, right? Oh, but then here's the killer. You can get away. You can avert the FLIPL if You go hands across America. You stand shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other soldiers and walk across in a line in the area where they last saw it. Again, this is the case in a training zone. It's also the case in a combat zone. So imagine you're flying a drone in Syria and it goes down. You have to get your soldiers on a line and find that drone. So this is just utterly, just beyond insane, guys. But it's not. It's completely normal for the U.S. Army, right? To sit there and say, listen, think about it. Just think for a minute. The drones in Ukraine, $250 a pop. What is an officer's time worth? Well, we can ballpark it, and we could say that 2 weeks of that, right? So the officer, let's say they work 50 weeks a year. And let's round it up. Let's say the cost of an officer in pay and benefits is around $100,000 a year. And, right, they take 2 weeks of vacation, so they work 50 weeks a year. That means an officer costs about $2,000 a week. If you assume they spend 2 weeks working that FLIPL as a full-time FLIPL investigator, the officer's time alone is $4,000, guys. If we're assuming that each drone, let's say the Army overpays pretty badly, let's say they pay twice what the Ukrainian military does for a cheapo drone, and you're looking at 8, right? The cost of investigating one missing drone is 8 drones. So this is exactly the kind of preposterousness that we talk about. And, you know, the fact is that the military is trying to accept the fact that it got caught so flat-footed. It really never foresaw that drones were going to dominate the battlefield like they are. But God bless them, they're trying. They're now making soldiers in basic training practice knocking down a drone, right? In Fort Sill, right, the home of the artillery, soldiers are conducting counter-drone drills during the Army's final basic training completion exercise thing, right? This is, of course, for Air Defense Artillery School and something called the Joint Counter Unmanned Aerial Systems University. So, again, this is something that probably is good. I want Army Air Defense soldiers to know how to operate a drone jammer. But boy, howdy, are we late to the party. But again, better late than never, as they say, though I think the thing that the military, there's another elephant in the room that I think the military just refuses to do, and that is develop a more economics-centric approach. See, the Army right now maintains its like elite soldier first status. What do I mean by that? That when it comes to fighting insurgents, right, you rely on a professional force. It's one of the reasons that the public tolerated 20 years of war, right? Would the American public have ever tolerated Iraq and Afghanistan if we were there for 20 years and there was a draft, right? Of course not. So the reason is we have this professional soldiery class, which means that when we fight, we can't afford to lose them because it's really expensive to replace them, right? And because we rely on so much high-tech gee-whiz technology, we need highly skilled soldiers to train and operate it. This is all well and good, but as we've seen in this conflict in Ukraine, that soldiers need to be less skilled than a typical Western military, and that it's more important to be able to operate economically, to sit there and go, hey, how do we train soldiers on the cheap? This is something Russia and Ukraine, and especially Russia, has mastered. They've said, how do we recruit soldiers cheaply? How do we train them cheaply? How do we equip them cheaply? And how do we get them onto the battlefield, right? And again, for Russia, they figured out a way to do it in such a way that they can afford to lose literally 30,000 soldiers a month. For context, right, the total U.S. military active force, let's see, how long would that last at Russia's current casualty rates? It's around 1.3 million active duty. This is wrong because it's stupid. It says about 1.4 million active personnel. So that means, let's see, how many years? So that means if Russia is losing, let's see, we have 1.4 million active duty soldiers. And if we were to fight a war with a Russian level of casualties, where we're looking at about 10,000 a month, we could sustain it for 10 years with our current force structure. But again, the U.S. military still needs to learn to bring in and fight more economically, right? And I think it really just needs to get to the point where it understands that it needs cheaper, more expendable things. It needs a lot more stuff to be expendable. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to all the Colonel tier members of CombatVetNews.com. Guys like Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., and Ida Skycall, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.